and welcome. I'm Darren Ma, your host for today's dialogue, Why Mountains Matter, bringing Indigenous knowledge and science together for International Mountain Day, hosted by the Reconciling Ways of Knowing Conference Society and the Canadian Mountain Network. I am joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in Vancouver, British Columbia. Today's webinar, Why Mountains Matter, is one of many events occurring around the world today to celebrate the United Nations International Mountain Day. Today's webinar is also the 6th dialogue in the Reconciling Ways of Knowing Forum series. We thank you all for joining us as we build towards an in-person conference, which will occur once the ongoing COVID-19 public health pandemic subsides. Before I turn it over to our amazing speakers, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is comprised of 2 sessions, assessing our mountain systems and the launch of the Canadian Mountain Assessment, followed by sustaining the biocultural diversity of our mountain regions. The 2 sessions will run approximately 3 hours with a short intermission in about 90 minutes. We are recording the dialogue, so anyone who is unable to participate for the entire session may view it at a later time online. We have turned the chat feature off and ask you to submit your questions through the question and answer box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. As we anticipate there will be a lot of questions, we will gather similar questions for our moderator so that we can best address as many questions as possible in the time allowed. Please submit your questions early. Also, please note that our speakers may have different Wi-Fi connections and volume levels based on their locations. We kindly request that you adjust your volume as needed. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Lisa Charlie Boy. Lisa is Silcotin from Saydidel First Nation, Interior, BC, and currently lives in the unceded traditional territory, the Secwepemc people in Shuswap, British Columbia. She is a widely published writer, editor, storyteller, television personality, and radio host who found her calling through her blog and 13-part biographical docuseries, Urban Native Girl. Lisa is an accomplished social media entrepreneur who co-founded and serves as the editor-in-chief of Urban Native Magazine, the co-creator and host of Urban Native Girl TV, and the co-editor of Dreaming in Indian, Contemporary Native American Voices. She has been called an Aboriginal storyteller for the digital generation by the National Post and named one of 3 Aboriginal millennials to watch by the Huffington Post. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to today's moderator, Lisa Charlie Boy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are so excited to be here. Today is International Mountain Day, which is an amazing and momentous occasion. And the Canadian Mountain Network and Reconciling Ways of Knowing have come together to present 2 panels today, just for International Mountain Day. And for the first panel of this Indigenous Knowledge and Science Forum, we will be speaking about the newly developed Canadian Mountain Assessment and reflect on considerations that are important for the implementation of assessment to steward and care for the biological and cultural diversity of our mountains. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists, Ira Provost, Catherine Tenise, and Dr. Graham McDowell. Ira Provost is from the Piikani Nation, a member of the Blackfoot Confederacy in southern Alberta. He is the manager of the Piikani Nation Consultation, representing their nation in external government relations as the liaison between external stakeholders and the nation to facilitate relationships for land development in their territory. Ira has a master's degree in Indigenous Studies with a focus on Indigenous knowledge in land use planning as it relates to the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. He has also developed innovative technologies for his nation in traditional knowledge data capture and meaningful implementation into business development. Welcome, Ira. Catherine Tenise is Ktunaxa nation chair, as well as chief negotiator for the ongoing treaty negotiations with Canada and British Columbia. Ms. Denise active participation in public service began in the late 1960s at the Columbia Lake Band as band counselor, band manager, and then later as the area coordinator for the Ktunaxa Nation Council. She has also worked in adult education and with a number of Vancouver-based Indigenous organizations. Catherine's recent public service includes being a member of the First Nations Summit Task Group, serving as the chair of the New Relationship Trust, and most recently as a member of the British Columbia Climate Solutions and Clean Growth Advisory Council. Catherine currently resides in Cranbrook, British Columbia. And next up, we have Dr. Graham Dell, who has studied lived experiences of climate change in high mountain regions, with a focus on vulnerability and adaptation to changes in glacial hydrology. He has led community level projects in the Nepal, Himalaya, Peruvian Andes, Rocky Mountains, Greenland, and Baffin Island, as well as numerous global scale evaluations of climate change vulnerability and adaptation in cold regions. Graham is also active in publishing and presenting his scholarly contributions and is committed to the mobilization of scientific knowledge, including through his work as a contributing author with the Intergovernmental Panel on the Climate Change. He is currently the project leader for the Canadian Mountain Assessment, which we'll be talking about further today, as well as Banting Postdoctoral Fellow affiliated with the University of Zurich and holds degrees from the University of British Columbia, the University of Oxford, and McGill University. Welcome, Graham. So first off, I'd actually like to start with Graham. And I'm wondering, Graham, if you can start off by telling us about the Canadian Mountain Assessment that you've been instrumental in developing and help us understand better why our mountain regions are so important.
Sure. Thanks so much, Lisa, for the question. And I'm happy to respond in just a moment, but I'd like to first start by acknowledging that that I'm joining this event from the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations of the Coast Salish peoples who've cared for lands in and around an area also referred to as Vancouver since time immemorial. Also want to thank the other panelists that are joining in our session today. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And I want to be clear that I'm coming to this event not as someone who claims to be an expert in reconciling ways of knowing, but as a non-Indigenous person who's on a journey of learning and indeed unlearning in an effort to better cultivate meaningful, respectful engagements between researchers and Indigenous peoples, particularly in the context of our understanding of mountain environments. And so I guess I just wanted to acknowledge that and then say that I will, although offer a few thoughts based on my particular perspective as a mountain researcher, as well as leader of the Canadian Mountain Assessment. And so, yeah, we're here together on International Mountain Day, and I think we should start then by talking a little bit about why mountains matter, as you've asked. So in total, about 24% of this country is covered in mountains. That makes it actually the fourth most mountainous country globally. And we see that we have very high diversity in our mountain areas, from the Coast Mountains in BC to the Mackenzie Mountains in the north, or the Rockies along the Continental Divide. In fact, all the way out east to the Torngat Mountains as well. And this leads to a really staggering spectrum of ecosystem types and very outstanding geological features and plants and animals. Our mountains are also the headwaters of Canada's major rivers and are important reserves of snow and ice that feed water supplies far downstream. Of course, Indigenous peoples have also inhabited mountain environments for thousands of years and developed place-based, diverse, and ever-evolving knowledges of mountains and their stewardship. Mountains in Canada have also inspired scientific work in this country in fields as diverse as geology, hydrology, and conservation biology, with scientific study of mountains dating back to the 1800s. Now, of course, it's important to also recognize that the meeting of settler and Indigenous cultures in mountain spaces in Canada also led to the displacement and dispossession of Indigenous peoples. Today, around 1.3 million people live in mountain areas in Canada. But if we think about the people who live adjacent to mountains, let's say within 100 kilometers of mountains, we actually find that 82% of Canada's population lives in proximity to mountains. And because of this, many of us depend either directly or indirectly on mountains for water, for food, for building materials, recreation, and much more. And of course, mountains are also sites of spiritual significance. They're places of solace and meaning. They're inspiration for art and literature and storytelling. But climate change and other impacts related to human activities, which are already leading to things like the loss of mountain glaciers, changes in mountain ecosystems, and increasing hazards in mountain areas, are now threatening to transform the ways that we know, relate to, and depend on mountains in Canada. However, despite the biocultural importance of Canada's mountains and the consequential threats that these regions are now facing, we actually have very little comprehensive understanding of mountain systems across this country. And that in turn is limiting our ability to move towards a more just, equitable, and sustainable future for Canada's mountain places and peoples. And so it's in this context that it's really my pleasure to formally announce the launch of the Canadian Mountain Assessment. The Canadian Mountain Assessment is a multi-year initiative supported by the Canadian Mountain Network that aims to address three fundamental questions. Namely, what do we know, not know, and need to know about Canada's diverse and rapidly changing mountain areas? And critically important in our view is also how we answer these questions. So what knowledges are we drawing on to do this? And who's involved in defining the assessment process? So while the work that we're doing is motivated by some of the exceptional prior mountain-focused assessments that we've seen by the IPCC or the Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment, for example, our approach is a bit different than these more science-driven assessments. And so in the Canadian Mountain Assessment, we're working to draw on both Western scientific knowledge, so peer-reviewed work from the scientific literature, but also Indigenous knowledges with the aim of advancing a more inclusive, multiple evidence-based understanding of mountain environments in Canada.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm really excited about hearing more about sort of the Indigenous inclusivity. And I just wanted to interject for a moment here to go back to Ira Provost to talk a little bit about sort of the Indigenous-based perspective and just opening everything here in a very spiritual, good way. So if you don't mind, Graham, we're just going to move to Ira, and then we will come back to you to expand more upon those concepts. Thank you. Ira, I would really appreciate if you were here on this panel next to just discuss a spiritual opening for this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, next so go on to go kanikwan get connects much no wow. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, panelists. Good morning, fellow good people working with the mountain and the mountain networks. I want to acknowledge all the attendees, those who come from a vast array of territories all across this land. I'm really humbled today to be asked to come and give just a quick opening spiritual prayer to this day and to this event. I come to you from the Niitsitapi territory, the territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, who are primarily in southeastern Rockies and into the prairies of southwestern Alberta. I'm very happy to acknowledge my elders, the people that I've learned from over the years and have walked a path within my Blackfoot ways of knowing. So I'm just going to give you a quick prayer, and we'll continue on with our day to acknowledge the good work that everyone's doing and continue on with that. I'll begin now, and I encourage you to give prayer and honor to your ways wherever you may be on the lands that you reside and work on. Hayo istapatapiop, hayo gitsmaspomaginan anakchitsukoi, gimoginan nestamatsokinan sugapi, kinapi makamatapi. Ayo Gimatukinan, Ayo Spumsan, Naninanix, Nazistananix, Nasnanix. Creator, we come to you today. We ask that you give us wisdom and guidance in the work that we do, the mountains that we care for, and the communities that we care for, in all the work that we do. We pray for those, our elderly, we pray for our youth, that they make good connections and that they're bound by the ways of our ancestors to continue to do good for our communities. We pray for this work that it continue on in a good way. We pray for those who are in our communities today. We pray for safety in our communities with this current pandemic that's going on. We ask that you be with those in our communities who need prayers, need support, need guidance and wisdom. And we give thanks for this this new era of the vaccine that's coming forward, that it reached those who need it right away. We pray for our elderly and those in care homes to be enlightened and given hope. For all of this, I pray for all of us as we travel, that we continue to travel safe and arrive back in this space once again down the road in a good way. Gamadam, Sami Batabisan. And thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate that. I also now want to just turn to two of our hosts here from Reconciling Ways of Knowing and from Canadian Mountain Network. So from Reconciling Ways of Knowing, we have Miles Richardson here, and I'll just turn to him first and ask him to just introduce himself and his role within this capacity. Miles, please go ahead.
Hello, Lisa. Thank you, and good morning to everyone. I'm right now speaking to you from the territory of my gracious hosts, the Musqueam people, the Musqueam Nation at the north mouth of the Fraser River. And I'm really pleased today to join with the Canadian Mountain Network and the work that Reconciling Ways of Knowing is doing. The Reconciling Ways of Knowing initiative saw that there's two essential ways of knowing, worldviews or stories, if you will, in Turtle Island, in what today we call Canada, that are seemingly struggling for legitimacy with each other or supremacy and guiding our actions. And that's the ancient continuing story of the original nation, Indigenous peoples, the original First Nations of this place we call Canada today, who've been here for millennia, for thousands of years, for hundreds of generations. I'm the living generation of a nation that's been scientifically dated to be in our homelands for 15,000 years. And we have this other way of knowing that that guides policy and action in Canada, that is science-based, that guides Western societies generally in the world. And, you know, as they struggle, as I've observed, as we've observed, neither of us are doing well. First Nations have been suffering the effects of this colonialism, and humankind generally is facing substantial and survival threatening challenges with climate change, with the loss of biological diversity. And our simple premise at Reconciling Ways of Knowing is that it's not a battle. It must not be a battle for supremacy between the two. We need both ways of knowing. And we need to figure out how to bring them together and have them each guide us in their respective place. So today, with being we're joined with the Canadian Mountain Network on International Mountain Day. The focus this year being biodiversity. It's a perfect issue. It's a perfect focus for us, as there's two things that we need to do, I believe, that we believe in Reconciling Ways of Knowing to address these issues. One, as we found right from the beginning of this, and Elder Ira Provost has reminded us again this morning, to be strong, to be successful, everything we do must begin with proper ceremony, must be done in the context of proper ceremony. And that we must recognize that we're all in this together, that figuring out our way through climate change, through protecting biodiversity and species loss, we've got to realize that we're all in this together as humans and with the rest of creation. And we have some really powerful and interesting stories today with the panelists. I'm really anxious to hear from Catherine Tenise and the story of the Tunaha people and their efforts to uphold their people's responsibility that has come through millennia to protect the grizzly bear spirit. It's an uplifting, hopeful story, and I hope you're all looking forward to hearing it. And all the other panelists have much to share. So Hawa, thank you, Lisa, and look forward to the panels today.
Thank you so much, Miles, for that brief introduction. That's really setting the tone for the panel today. And next up, I wanted to invite Norma Cassie from the Canadian Mountain Network to also just give a brief word on the role of the Canadian Mountain Network and an introduction to that company as well. And she is the co-research director there. Norma, please.
Thank you, Lisa. Masito. I was on mute there. Drin Gwinzi Shalaknai. Jat Nokwahdi and Jitlaju Jitrig, height Nathan. I'm happy to be here in good health and good thoughts with everybody out there. I understand there's approximately 400 people hooked on to the webinar. Thank you very much for all of your interest and thank you for coming. I'm Vantat Kuchin. I'm People of the Lakes. I come from North America's second biggest wetlands up in the Arctic in North Yukon Territory. And I'm also, I'm Wolf. And my Kuchin name is Kwahakati, means one who gives their last cup of tea. And I was born and raised in this beautiful area of wetlands where there's thousands of lakes and with a huge abundance of biodiversity of every kind, where thousands of birds from all over the world converge on our homelands and from all over the world, like Argentina, Chesapeake Bay, all the way down to Hawaii and all over the world. These birds come to grace our homelands and we take care of the lands for them. And they lay their eggs all over the place and it's just amazing. And then and a huge caribou herd. Right now we have the biggest migrating caribou herd left on the planet. So we do everything in our power to take care of those. And of course, climate change is taking a huge havoc on everything. I was taught during that time that every plant and insect and all the Arctic species that we grew up with were all interconnected and that we have this sacred relationship in these special, precious and all the precious species and all our homelands, the mountains, the wetlands, the big rivers are all interconnected worldwide. We are all one. We're all joined up together. So anyways, I was asked to join the Canadian Mountain Network to assist in building Indigenous partnerships in Canada. And this was really exciting for me to to work with Indigenous peoples to let them know that the Canadian Mountain Network the application is being developed, and we need to get on board because it was working towards Indigenous-led research for the first time in this country. So when the grant was accepted, the Canadian Mountain Network then established itself in around 2019, and to support the resilience and health of Canada's mountain peoples and places through research and partnerships, and also based on Indigenous-led and Western ways of knowing that inform decision-making that's relative, that will come to action in research. We do need to remember, though, as Miles alluded to a little bit, was that we need to remember that Indigenous science and knowledge and our methodologies have historically been devalued and overlooked by Western research approaches in academia and pretty much everywhere. Our people have fought, our elders have fought a long battle for many years to occupy an equal seat at the table with research institutions and at every level. So Canada's colonial history of oppression towards Indigenous peoples has meant that its structures, programs, etc., have all left painful, lasting legacies. Very importantly, its approaches to conservation. So many, and not only that, many of the parks and protected areas were also created to displace Indigenous peoples from our homelands in the name of conservation. So our ancient and traditional and natural laws of conservation were ignored, our languages, our cultures, governing systems, and ancient ways of stewardships to our homelands. However, we are here today with a lot of changes in Canada, in this country. I'm very happy to join this great team, the Canadian Mountain Network, and we have an opportunity now to begin building those partnerships with Indigenous and peoples and Western knowledge systems. And we're now developing a network that will include research institutions and Indigenous organizations in research. So by approving our proposal in 2019, the National Council of Excellence, National Center of Excellence made history by recognizing that Indigenous and Western ways of knowing and doing are equally important and valid. They can complement each other to give us deeper understanding of our Earth systems. In our partnerships, we strive to create ethical spaces where knowledge systems interact with mutual respect, kindness, and generosity as we do our work going forward. That all systems are equal, and that no one system has more weight or legitimacy than the other. And our goals as the Canadian Mountain Network is to help us understand environmental, economic, and social changes in mountain systems and ecosystems, a diverse and collaborative community of research to bring together researchers and Indigenous peoples together in doing research moving forward. And it's also setting new standards for partnerships across the sectors that will empower respect and bring together Western science and Indigenous traditional knowledge. So Canadian Mountain Network also currently supports several research projects that are Indigenous led or in partnership with Indigenous organizations already. So welcome to our webinar, and we will talk more as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Norma. I really appreciate that. I love hearing more about how everything is interconnected. And I think that is so important in both the Indigenous-based knowledge and the science-based knowledge. And I just hope that you will expand upon that more at a later time. Next, I want to go back to Dr. Graham McDowell to discuss a little bit more about the Canadian Mountain Assessment, as he had already expanded on the idea of why mountains matter and why it's so important. And I found it super fascinating that 24% of our country is mountains. I did not know that. So there were some very interesting facts there. So Graham, can you please enlighten this panel?
Hey, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, it looks like we had a little bit of a hiccup with the ordering there, so I'm glad that we got to make space for Ira's prayer and for starting us in a good way, and also to have knowledge and perspective shared by Miles and Norma. That's so important. So thanks for that. Yeah, I was saying that the Canadian Mountain Assessment is really sort of building out of some of the ideas that Norma shared with us, where we want to bring together Western ways of knowing with Indigenous ways of knowing to try to advance a more inclusive and multiple, knowledge-based approach to understanding mountains. And so I'll just continue by saying that what we're working towards here is an assessment that's going to be basically a multi-chapter, multi-author report that's going to provide the first look across Canada at what we know about various topics and mountain geographies based on these multiple types of knowledge. And so we're hoping to provide this assessment to the general public in late 2022 or sometime in 2023. And really, this assessment is expected to help set the mountain research and policy agenda for the coming decade, including by drawing greater attention to the role of Indigenous-led research and conservation, but also to support efforts to identify and adapt to the kinds of changing conditions we're seeing across mountain environments in Canada. I think quite importantly, to provide an example of how respectfully braiding insights from Western ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of knowing can lead to a fuller understanding of topics of shared interest. And so here, one of the objectives of this project is to really try to honor, uphold, and advance key tenets of UNDRIP, of the TRC calls to action, of OCAP principles, and of FPIC. And so I think the assessment is properly understood both as a knowledge product, but also as a means of establishing a process that leads to decisions about mountains in this country that are based on diverse ways of knowing that have been shared in an ethical manner. And so that sounds perhaps good in theory, but what does that look like in practice? So it's early days for us, but I wanted to share a little bit about what we've been working on. So to ensure that the mountain assessment is based on the best available knowledge, it's guided by a multi-level governance structure that we've developed, and involves researchers, Indigenous peoples, and government representatives. We have a Canadian advisory committee that includes great folks like Ira and other really amazing advisors across this country who come from various mountain regions and also respective areas of knowledge and expertise. We also have an international advisory committee that's composed of some people who are leading thinkers around mountain issues globally, and also involved in the advocacy of Indigenous knowledge at the global level. So here we have folks like the UNESCO Chair in Sustainable Mountain Development, and the former co-chair of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platforms to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, amongst others. And then we also work really closely with the Canadian Mountain Network leadership. So with Norma, Cassidy, who we've heard from, and also Marie Humphreys, who's here with us today. And then I serve in this role as project leader, where I'm accountable for co-developing and coordinating and ultimately delivering this assessment. In addition to this core team of folks we have working on the project, we are going to have chapter teams that include leading researchers and recognized Indigenous knowledge holders who can bring relevant expertise to each chapter. We also are working with facilitation specialists and some students to contribute to this project as well. So we have a large and growing and quite diverse group of people who are working on this assessment. And just to give you a few bits of flavor about the nuts and bolts of this before moving on to other panelists, for several months now, the core group of project members has been involved in a process of co-developing the assessment approach and protocols. And given this pandemic that we all find ourselves in, this has largely occurred through virtual meetings. Nevertheless, we've endeavored to create ethical space for respectful dialogue here, including by having elders open our meetings with proper ceremony. So as I said, it's still early days, but some of the things we've been talking through include the kind of conceptual foundations for this assessment. And here we're drawing on what's been termed multiple evidence-based approach. And this is where where Indigenous and scientific knowledges are understood as leading to different manifestations of equally valid and useful knowledge. And here the idea is that we achieve an enriched understanding of a specific issue, for example, mountains, by looking at complementarities, synergies, and divergences across these diverse knowledge systems. And critically, this approach recognizes the integrity of knowledge systems on their own terms. So evaluation of which kinds of knowledge are useful or relevant occurs primarily within knowledge systems rather than across ways of knowing. And this also means that different forms of knowledge are not thought of as being integrated. Rather, the goal is the respectful braiding of knowledge, so akin to some of the ideas that Robin Wall-Kimmer shared in their earlier Reconciling Ways of Knowing presentation. We've also been working around the idea of having ethical foundations for this work. A point of confluence is the idea that engagement with Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous knowledge holders be guided by principles for ethical knowledge sharing and co-production, which Ira and some other folks have been involved in developing, and I'll hope that he can speak to some of that later today. And we think that having this kind of ethical framework underpin this work is really important in terms of ensuring that this project proceeds in a good way. Our assessment of scientific work is likewise guided by ethical principles like transparency, reproducibility, avoidance of conflicts of interest, and there we're following the Government of Canada's policy on scientific integrity. The last point I wanted to touch on was this idea of respectfully braiding knowledge, and this is really a core tenet of our assessment. And so we've been thinking through what this actually looks like in practice. What does this mean for our endeavor? And on one hand, this is actually the whole process that we're involved in. The knowledge braiding is not just the assessment, it's the ways that we come together and discuss what we're doing. But on the other hand, we're also trying to get some level of clarity about what an assessment chapter might look like that does this. And so just as an example, at a basic level, we hope to include different manifestations of knowledge. So not just text that reports findings of scientific studies, but also things like embedded links to videos with interviews with knowledge holders and accounts of oral histories, arts-based content, maps, pictures, sound recordings. Importantly, also original place names and providing space for Indigenous languages, because we know that language is intrinsically woven into knowledge. And we might do something like an accompanying website to provide access to some of this interactive media as well. So still all much early days and an ongoing and lively discussion, but those are some of the things we've been working through. Just as we look forward in the near term, we're really aiming to kind of further define these protocols for knowledge sharing and braiding, and then working on what the actual structure of this assessment will be in terms of the kind of topics we're going to try to come together to advance understanding of. And this is also going to provide a space for our Indigenous advisors to more thoroughly, we hope, express how the CMA should be planned, structured, and implemented in ways that are respectful of Indigenous knowledges and meaningful to Indigenous communities. And beyond that, we're going to start working towards identifying specific authors and getting chapter teams going. So I won't say more. I just want to say that this is a large, complex, and perhaps somewhat ambitious project, and we fully recognize it will fall short in some areas. But we're committed to the spirit and intent of this assessment, and to the idea that we can meaningfully advance understanding of Canadian mountain systems in a good way with the time and resources that we do have available to us. So thanks, Lisa, and others, for the chance to talk a little bit about the assessment. I'm really looking forward to knowing the thoughts of our other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, for sharing that about the CMA. That's super exciting. I love the idea of the embedding links and expanding upon the stories and making those available, and having that sort of different sort of media layers embedded in the ways to share that knowledge. That's really fantastic. Now I want to turn to Ira Provost. Now, Ira, you played a key role in developing the approach of the Canadian Mountain Assessment. And I'm wondering that if you can build upon what Graham has said about the role of the multi-evidential approach in the Canadian Mountain Assessment. And can you tell us more about how such a multi-evidential approach should work, particularly with respect to ethics of knowledge sharing and knowledge co-production? I know that this is your area of expertise in data capture, and this is such a pertinent topic right now, and I'm hoping you will touch upon that. Thank you, Ira.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Graham, for that introduction. Once again, I want to thank everyone for the time to speak today, and I'll try to keep it brief. I come to you with my knowledge from my Blackfoot elders and way of life. My wife and I were transferred members into the Iitskina, or the Horn Society, who play an integral role of the Akokatsin, or the Blackfoot Sun Dance. Our role is to be knowledge keepers who protect and transfer the knowledge of the content and the protocol of our ways. And the Nitsitapi, like all Indigenous nations, have a rich and incredibly complex knowledge system that has been activated and interacting with their environment since time immemorial. So when I come to you today, I do want to say that although I come to get to you and to this group with this knowledge, there's a sacred component, but there's also a very common knowledge component to the way in which we interact with our environment. But I do want to stress that from my understanding in my ways of life, our environment is so complex in how we interact through it and to it with ceremony and with protocol. And it's very hard to pin down and pinpoint one particular aspect of our knowledge just because of the complexity of it, that to compare it to Western science is actually a challenge. It's quite a challenge. From my side, we know generally we can read in textbooks what science has to offer, and as have I. But we've yet to scratch the surface of our own Indigenous knowledges and how they're to interact with a non-Indigenous environment. But we do know that with that complexity, there's so much potential for understanding and working together. I'm very encouraged in this day and age where we've come to the idea of braiding. For myself and my knowledge and what I've come to know from my elders is that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of being is astronomical, and to confine it to just to science is quite defeating the potential that's there with understanding the comprehensive knowledges that are there, and the ways of being that can very much impact our ecosystems and in our biological being with our environment. But there is ways that we can begin to take those steps to make the understanding of Indigenous knowledges and Western sciences coexist. Absolutely. But I will preface it though with that to create those relationships, it's a matter of time. Therefore, I know I think I only have about 9 or 8 minutes left to talk. I will not capture everything that potentially will be in that time, nor will I do it over the course of a couple of days. It takes a long time to develop a relationship with that knowledge, to properly understand how it can be as effective in developing these knowledge systems. What we've done and what we've begun to do, and only begun to do, as Graham has mentioned, that we have just begun to create an ethical workspace for these knowledges to coexist and to begin to co-create something that is meaningful to both sides. So in my graduate work, I've done a lot of studies on and understandings of meaningful, and meaning can be quite can have so many meanings, multiple meanings to one group of people to another. Certainly to even amongst Indigenous people, what meaning actually means. And it's important for us to have a common understanding of the meaningfulness of knowledge development, and again, knowledge co-creation. We need to understand and have a common language between us that helps us bring together these things that that can assist us in moving forward in a good way together. And that's what we're doing with the Canadian Mountain Network and the Canadian Mountain Assessment, is developing these ethical guidelines and these ethical spaces. We have within the Canadian Mountain Network a number of recommendations that will be presented and going forward. At the moment, they're just in draft. They're just being developed, but they're going to be put forward in the Canadian Mountain Assessment, hopefully in a good way that's acceptable to all. For those of us who work in Indigenous communities, we know that to work together, it's never going to be a simple cut and dried, you do this, I do this, and we come together and everything's just acceptable. We have to acknowledge that within the work that we do, we need to acknowledge the multiple nations that are out there. Now, I come to this table with the Blackfoot understanding, with the Niitsitapi way of life. But there are certainly other knowledges that are out there that should be explored, that should be understood, because they have so much to offer. And I know we're going to hear more from Norma. We're going to hear from Catherine. And in my experiences working with other Indigenous nations, certainly just within my province of Alberta, I've learned and gained so much in the stories that I've heard from my counterparts in Northern Alberta, in some of their creation stories, how they work with the land, how they are enriched in their surroundings. And I'm like a sponge, and I soak it up, and it enriches who I am and the work that I do with my nation. And so so to hear a lot of the stories that are out there are certainly important. And before I run out of time, I do want to acknowledge my histories and my connections of the Blackfoot to mountains. And like I say, I can only speak to certain parts of the knowledge that's out there. But I'll speak in general terms of some of our stories that we have. So who we are as Blackfoot people, we are very much rooted in ceremony. And it's a labor of love. It's a lifestyle. You have to be very much involved to really understand it. I think I'm going to hope to grow very much older, and I don't think that at the end of my time, I'll fully understand and comprehend everything that is there in my culture. But I'm there to work with it and to live with it. The Blackfoot, our creation stories come from the mountains. We, within the Blackfoot ceremonies or the Blackfoot Sundance, are very much rooted in the reference of bundles, of sacred bundles. Now, one of our main bundles that was given to us by Stabatabi, or our creator, is the beaver bundle. And the beaver bundle came from the mountains. There's a very elaborate story. I'm happy to share the story with you. But sometimes these stories, they take days long to tell. And it takes time. But I acknowledge that that our
It looks like we're having some internet connectivity issues, so I'm just going to pause for a moment with Ira so that we can hear his story, and we'll come back to it at the end. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end, a very short one, but please be sure to put your questions in the chat so that we can get back to them as we close this panel. And if you joined us a little bit late, this is the panel on assessing our understanding of mountains with panelists Dr. Graham Dell, Ira Provost, who we just heard from, and Catherine Denise. So I would actually like to turn to Catherine next, and Catherine will be sharing the insights she has gained in her role as chair of the Ktunaxa Nation that can help inform the development of efforts to steward our mountain regions, like the Canadian Mountain Assessment. Catherine, can you tell us more about what your nation has done to protect Gatmuk, the spirit of the grizzly, and the co-management relationships that your nation is developing with other partners, and any advice you would have for others undertaking a partnership-based approach for caring for mountain regions? Catherine?
Thank you, Lisa. First of all, I'd like to begin by saying good day to each and every one of you, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I realize that the event that we're involved with today is kind of a conglomeration of two different events that were initially planned prior to the COVID intervention in our lives. And so obviously we're going to be trying to put together a lot of information in a very short period of time, but I do want to acknowledge the organizers and thank them for the opportunity to tell our story. And I'm speaking to you today from the homeland of the Ktunaxa people, Amakis Ktunaxa. So our story, and I will try as best I can to relate it back to the comments that we heard earlier from Graham, and a portion of the comments that we heard from Ira, as well as Norma's sort of overall description of some of the efforts of the Canadian Mountain Network. I mean, it's I think that we're looking forward to the work that is going to be undertaken in terms of the research efforts, and I was very, very pleased to hear, you know, the emphasis on the ethical approach. This is not always the case as it relates to dealing with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples when it comes to research efforts. That, you know, for a long time that our information was taken and used pretty indiscriminately without a lot of ethical application. So I'm really happy to hear that that's an important part of the Canadian Mountain Assessment. And I guess where I'm coming from, and as I tell the story of Gatmuk, which is something that's very important to Ktunaxa people, and is it relates to our 30-year journey. But I want to connect all of this is connected by worldview, and Miles touched on it in his opening comments. And I think that that's a really important perspective that that we make sure that we take into account as in all of the work that we're doing, that we are recognizing that we're never going to be able to fully come to a place where we can, and again, you know, where we can do other than braid the information. So I'm really, again, that's another approach that I was really happy to hear about, because too often we're, you know, that there's a sort of a comparative approach that's taken, and that, you know, that isn't always all that helpful, when in fact that each of us has something to contribute to the conversation and to the information. So the idea of an approach where information is braided is something that I'm surely appreciative of. So just in terms of worldview, I mean, one of the things that is extremely important, and that we as the Ktunaxa sort of base a lot of our thinking when it comes to land-based activity, is the fact of the recognition of Akhame Kapikapsin, which means, is speaking about all living things. So we always look at things in the context of ensuring that we are talking about all living things, that and that we really can't talk about one piece of our environment in isolation from other things that occur in our world. So our story involves a 30-year fight to halt the development of a massive ski resort in the Purcell Range that would have been built in an area of utmost spiritual and cultural importance to the Ktunaxa people. So our long struggle to protect Gatmuk saw us having to defend our land, our beliefs in provincial courtrooms, and eventually at the Supreme Court of Canada. Our opposition was not based solely on cultural grounds. Gatmuk is also an area of environmental concern, and particularly around grizzly bear habitat and connectivity. We were not alone in our opposition to this development, however. There were a number of groups who opposed the resort on similar biodiversity concerns. The case we brought to the Supreme Court of Canada was unique. Should freedom of religion not extend to Indigenous people in this country? I mean, that was the question that we were asking. And should not that include the protection of sacred places from destruction? Obviously, the answer was no. You know, the Supreme Court of Canada could not wrap its mind around the questions that we were bringing forward. And one of the things that we're hopeful of is that we've opened the door, and that other nations will be able to expand upon the arguments that we brought forward, and look toward some of the things that we've raised in our fight to the Supreme Court of Canada, and hopefully get that, we can move forward down the path of further expanding on the application and the ability for the institutions of Canada to include Indigenous people. Because right now we very much see ourselves as being sort of almost spectators to activity that takes place in this country around things like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that they seem to be applicable to many, but not always they're not always able to wrap their minds around the concerns that we bring forward. So ultimately, we weren't successful in convincing the court that Gatmuk was intrinsically intertwined with Ktunaxa spirituality. We knew that bringing the argument to the Supreme Court was a risk, but it was one that had to be taken, win or lose. The irony of having to defend our most important spiritual beliefs in a system that has only existed for a fraction of time that the Ktunaxa have been on this earth was never lost on us. And I think that's an important point to make, that we were bringing forward an argument about something that an institution like the Supreme Court of Canada simply did not have the capacity to wrap its mind around, and that was evident by the decision that was taken. So despite the numerous setbacks in the court system, we never wavered from our resolve to protect Gatmuk. So it was on January 18th of 2020 that our decades-long fight finally came to an end. It was here in Amakas Ktunaxa, right in our Ktunaxa Nation government building, that we announced that Gatmuk would be protected forever. Surrounded by Ktunaxa citizens and joined by government representatives, funding partners, and community supporters, the Ktunaxa Nation announced that Gatmuk would now be part of an Indigenous protected and conserved area and be safe from development forever. And I think that it's really important that there are other ways that we could look at protection of places, but the idea of the Indigenous protected and conserved area approach was one that really appealed to us because it put the Ktunaxa Nation in the driver's seat as it relates to moving forward on this issue. So the IPCAs exist to protect and conserve ecosystems and are Indigenous led, and that was why we were so inclined to move down that path. Ktunaxa will be the decision makers on stewardship and conservation issues within the Gutmuk IPCA. There's still much work to be done as we establish the geographical boundaries of the Gutmuk IPCA, but it's important to note that our fight was never about excluding people from experiencing the area in its natural, as close to pristine as we can state. We will continue to collaborate with those who fought alongside us to keep Gutmuk protected. And while our reasons for why this place is so important to us may differ, we all have the same end goal, and the end of this piece of our journey is in sight, but we have much further to go. The past 30 years have been filled with highs and lows, defeats and successes, but never the loss of hope. There are times when it appeared the system was stacked against us, but we persevered. Our win is a win for conservation and for all Indigenous people in this country. So I'm hoping that as I told our story, that we can see the connection between what we're talking about today and the fact that today is International Mountain Day, and the importance of being able to demonstrate that there is a connection between everything that we do, so that when we do talk about things and when we make reference to all living things, that we are demonstrating that by the activities that we're involved with. I expect that our team will be working with the Canadian Mountain Network as they move forward in the assessment work, and hopefully that we will be afforded the opportunity to provide our input toward the work that is being undertaken, and be able to demonstrate that here it is a real life or practical application or a practical way of working together on something that is important to all of us as citizens of this planet, because we all know that the planet has many things that are causing concern these days, and most of those things are caused by us as human beings. So it's important that together that all of us that have our knowledge, that we put them together and share them and work together to try to find solutions to the many things that are impacting the world that we live in today. So I will leave my comments at that, but close by saying that we see that the work that we're doing is one way of enacting or implementing Article 25 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that speaks to the connection of a place and spirituality, for Indigenous people. And that is an important, for us, that's an important article, not to, as in addition to obviously the whole of the declaration. And we look to working on how it is that we're going to bring the appropriate pressures to bear to both British Columbia and Canada to ensure that their legislation that they have brought forward, I mean, BC has passed their legislation, Canada has introduced their legislation, but I believe that it's up to the Indigenous population to ensure that they're breathing life into this work, and that that we're in it from the start, and that we are very much in the driver's seat, because it's about us. And so, as I've heard people say, nothing about us without us. So I'll close my comments at that. So thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and thank you to my colleagues on this panel, Dr. McDowell and Elder Provost. Tacha.
Shanalia, for sharing your information. That is so fantastic to hear about your story and really bringing the conversation to the heart of matters when we're talking about the sacredness of mountains. And this summer, I actually spent a lot of time in the Chilko Lake Range of mountains, which is sacred for our Sokotin people. And it was so healing and incredible and beautiful. And I hope that everyone gets to appreciate that in their own territories. So thank you. So we are going to move on to the question and answers now. But first I want to go back to Ira because we did have some internet connectivity issues. And I really wanted to hear Ira's story about the beaver bundle. Now, he said it would take 2 days to tell, so I'm hoping that he can try to bring that down a little bit to the best that he can, because it's obviously a beautiful topic. But if we can get an introduction, a little taste, then we can always find out more on our own. Ira, please share.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Catherine, for your comments and your stories. I take it very much to heart. I'll sum up really quick. I apologize. That was my connection. It goes in and out, so therefore I'll speak fast. So when I was referring to the story of the beaver bundle, all that I was talking about, in essence, was the idea of our creation and our connection to the land, to the mountains and the ecosystems that flow from. I think what I'm happy to do is that what I take great pride in being Blackfoot is that we're able to see the life flow of our mountain systems as they trickle on into the foothills and then ultimately into the prairies. So we're able to see the progression of life that comes from our mountains and how it enriches many more landscapes in addition to the mountains. But I won't get into a lot of the specifics about the beaver bundle. A lot of it is for ceremony, but we have multiple bundles, and I'm just really, I think my purpose in talking about it was just to explain the complexities and the richness of these items that are sacred to our people. So I'll leave it there, and thank you, Lisa, and I'll turn it back to you. And thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to speak and to address the crowd.
Thank you, Ira. I actually have a question for you that I think you could speak to very well, given your ancestral territory. We have a question from the audience. As Indigenous people, how do we convey and protect the sacredness of mountains and other important places, features, relations, when that seems to be in conflict with resource extraction industry goals? Or if one child grows up understanding a mountain is sacred and another child sees the mountain as an opportunity, how do we braid those perspectives?
Thank you for that. So it's a challenge. It absolutely is a challenge. And I'll say that it's a challenge because of the province that I live in. We're very much, with Alberta, we are very much a resource development province. And for us to create that balance in between our way of life and the idea of developing those areas, again, there is no easy answer, absolutely. But what I will say is that it's important for those communities to take stock, to understand their who they are, to mobilize their elders, to mobilize the people, the knowledge keepers in their community, to collect those knowledges and have a firm understanding about how to communicate those knowledges to everybody else so that they understand it. There is sacredness in all that we do and there's things that we hold dear and protect amongst our people. And that's what I said earlier. I'm a protector of who I am in my ways. But there is strength in that knowledge for us to work together to understand what works for one nation and what works for one group of people to the other. But my best advice is to understand those knowledges and what they mean. For us, and you referred to this in your initial question, Lisa, for us, it was development of technologies that are available today, how we can capture these knowledges and keep them for our future generations. I am not going to say that everything that I hold sacred in my territory is not going to be disturbed, but I am going to protect it until I can no longer protect it. And I don't mean that in a defeatist way. I certainly mean that in a hopeful way, that we as knowledge keepers in our community, it's our job to protect the knowledge, protect those ways of life. And however we can do that, that's appropriate to our each individual nations, it needs to be done. So I hope that answers the question, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate your insight, Ira. I have another question that is very much related to that, but I wanted to get another perspective and bring it back to Norma. And Norma, we have another question from our participants or delegates today. And the question is, how do we braid these ways of knowing without one taking over the other? And I realize that this question is also braiding the last question. That seems to be the theme of this conversation in braiding, but I'd love to hear more of your perspective.
I think another part of the discussion later will be why it is that we need to work together in all aspects of what's going on with the world biodiversity right now and what's happening. So how do we braid research? We actually just collaborate and partner up, sit together, do research together, and look at these systems in collaboration. We will find from the Indigenous way, we don't just research one entity, we look at the entire ecosystems. For example, if we are going to research mountains, then we know that our mountains give water, they give shelter, they give us places where our people can increase their skills. There are special places for caribou, for animals, for species, mountain species. They are very special, but they do come down to the land to work with us as well as Indigenous peoples and other peoples in the communities. So braiding research would mean sitting with us at the table or working together in the field with Indigenous peoples, educating our youth, whether they are highly academics or not. They could be 15, 16 years old from our communities where we want to really engage with others in the academic world so that our young people can learn from them as well, that we work together in the area of researching biodiversity for sure. We have no time to waste. It's time for healing now. We have to work together. We cannot continue down the path of destruction and keep on going this way. We have got to, my people have been here, it's been documented for 30,000 years when giant beavers and mammoths were walking around. So like we have knowledge. We have knowledge to share. We know our country. There's newcomers in our country and come with some tremendous skills and have done tremendous work over the years as scientists. We also need to be a part of that and learn from that. However, a lot of our research from our regions and our communities will have to be led by our people.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those words. I really resonate with that idea of making sure that we're working with everyone and not working in silos and trying to do everything ourselves, because it's just not possible. And it definitely seems to be sort of the age upon us to all really collectively work for a greater future and a greater earth. So I wanted to just turn to Graham here to sort of build upon that, the question, and to kind of bring it back to the Canadian Mountain Assessment. And I know there's so much of an approach of embedding and braiding Indigenous knowledge with Western knowledge within this Canadian Mountain Assessment, which is fantastic. And I'm just hoping that you can repeat, this is from the audience, repeat the 3 questions that the Mountain Systems Assessment is aiming to answer. And building upon that, what is the intent and how will it be used?
Sure, thanks. Thank you, Lisa, and thanks for other thoughts that have been added by Norman and Ira. The 3 questions are: what do we know, not know, and need to know about Canada's diverse and rapidly changing mountain systems? These are very high-level questions, and we're actually engaged in a process of defining more discrete guiding questions that would lead the work of specific author teams. I want to follow up on this idea of braiding. It's a really important one, and one that we're committed to in this work. So the idea of respectfully braiding knowledges is a first step. It's a metaphor for what we want to do, but it doesn't resolve the pre-existing inequities and power differences between Western scientific knowledges and Indigenous knowledges. And so we know from the beginning that if we were to try to integrate, right, that would never lead to a process of equitable or more balanced representation of knowledges because of those power asymmetries. And so braiding for us, I think, really hinges on the idea that there's an ethical framework for how that takes place. And that, again, is something that Ira can speak more to with respect to the particular ethical framework that we're thinking about drawing from in our work. But I think this idea of not ending up in a place where the braiding is so lopsided is also about the process. It's about being in conversation with one another. It's about being in spaces like this. It's about being together in ethical space during our meetings and building trust and respect for one another and one another's knowledge. And knowing that these concerns are there and that there are power dimensions that underlay the efforts that we are involved in, and that those need to be acknowledged and addressed explicitly. And ultimately, and fortunately, in the context of the mountain assessment, we're in control of how that braiding looks at the end of the day. So when we have these conversations, we are together at the table building respect and trust. We can work towards a space where the ultimate outcome is something that tries to, insofar as we are able, be deferential to the different kinds of knowledge that are out there. And so in terms of the intent of the assessment, of course, we want to provide a really thorough assessment of what we know about mountain systems across this country to inform the kind of decisions that need to be made to support more resilient futures. We can't have a thorough understanding of mountains without drawing on the knowledges that are so much deeper and more place-based than a lot of the more recent scientific work that's been conducted around mountains in this country. We need to have both. And so the intent is also not just to show what we know about mountains, but to also show a process or a way of moving forward such that the institutions that Catherine has mentioned, which are not very receptive to working from Indigenous ways of knowing, actually have a platform to be brought to the table in a really, let's say, formalized way. And so the intent is to show how to do this and what the benefits of this can be for all manner of stakeholders across the country, and that this can inform the kind of conversations we're having going forward. I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. We do have another question from the audience in regards to actual education. So we're kind of going to bring it back. So just give me 1 second to pull up this question from the chat. Too many open tabs. I'm sure many of you can relate. Apologize. Okay, I found it. I'm wondering, actually, I'm going to throw this to Miles to see if he can expand upon this, Miles Richardson, to address this question, whether there are national scale efforts among educators to incorporate different ways of knowing in schools and to bring Indigenous knowledge to the table in a meaningful way. I'm wondering if you have any insight on that, Miles, from your participation with the University of Victoria. Miles?
Thanks, Lisa. At the University of Victoria, I'm director of the National Consortium for Indigenous Economic Development that's working to support Indigenous economic development across this country. But in pursuit of what you're saying, in pursuit of acknowledging and advocating that Indigenous traditional knowledge is an important part of a policy making or a economy building environment going forward, UVic and NCIED have been involved in this Reconciling Ways of Knowing initiative to include, make sure that Indigenous traditional knowledge is included in the dialogue. I'm trying to read the prompt here to start my video. So yeah, that's how we ended up here. Dr. David Suzuki and Nancy Turner and Elder Dave Corshane and I came together and started pulling together scientists and Indigenous knowledge keepers to make exactly that point and promote that point. So yes, UVic and many other universities you see that are involved in the Canadian Mountain Network right across the country are involved in a similar initiative. It's a very very supportive and interesting approach. I know we're getting close on time, but this in pursuing that, this has just been an amazing panel. You know, if the question about how do we begin braiding these two ways of knowing together, and reconciling ways of knowing is promoting a dialogue. And remember, each of these ways of knowing are based on the same truth. There are different perspectives on that truth, but let's remember there's only one truth. We all only have one creator, and each of us struggle in our own ways to understand what that truth is. And having the dialogue is a beginning of bringing these two important ways of knowing together. Look at the Ktunaxa Nation and Catherine Tenise, what they've taught us. They've shown us the importance of Indigenous people implementing their own responsibilities in their territories through their own law. You know, Ktunaxa Nation has come forward and Canada has come forward and produced this ski proposal. Ktunaxa just kept living their life as they have for millennia, carrying out their responsibility. And when they couldn't resolve through dialogue this impasse with the ski resort, they went and asked the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada, as Catherine said, looked at it in good faith, but they didn't have the capacity to deal with this human responsibility to protect the grizzly bear spirit. Clearly, that's the Ktunaxa Nation's responsibility. And if the Ktunaxa people don't uphold that responsibility, Canada is the poorer for it. So Canada and BC and their part of the river, going down the river in their boat, beside the Ktunaxa and their boat carrying out their responsibility, it's essential that we recognize that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miles, for that. That's greatly appreciated to get your insight in here again. I just want to remind everyone that we will be breaking for 15 minutes. We are just closing out this panel now, and we'll be back at 11:40 for sustaining the biocultural diversity of our mountain regions. And I want to thank everyone for their participation in this panel, to all the panelists. our provost, Dr. Graham Dell, Catherine Denise, and thank you, Miles and Norma, for also joining this conversation. And of course, thank you to all of you out there that are watching and participating and taking in this knowledge. We're so thankful to be all here together in this virtual space today for International Mountain Day. So that's all for this panel. I hope that you got some great insights from that. And once again, if you want to review anything, this is recorded and will be available online for review again, or if you want to share the information that you gleaned here. Thank you all, and we will see you again in 15 minutes.